Tom has been honing his craft over the course of what I think is a genuinely distinguished career. And there's nobody I can think of that would do this better. He spent decades in advertising, starting out as a copywriter and then quickly rising to be a creative director at some of the world's most celebrated agencies. He's helped the world's biggest brands tell their stories, and that means he knows how to make dull things interesting. And those are his words, I should say, not mine, although perhaps, Tom, I'm quoting you a little out of context there. So he's also learned how to do this in short time frames, 30-second TV spots, 60-second radio spots. He's made Super Bowl commercials. He was the creative behind campaigns with the likes of Muhammad Ali, Cindy Crawford, Alec Baldwin, and Mikhail Gorbachev. He's also a passionate traveler, actually. If you joined early, you heard us talking about a recent visit to Paris where he did, was it 9 VoiceMap tours? And for a decade before he started making audio tours, he says he was sampling them on VoiceMap, he promises, but also other platforms. Some, he says, were good, others were really good, but most left him feeling that they could have been so much better. So when he retired fairly recently and a little early, he started pushing himself to see what he could do with this medium. Tom's published 19 tours so far, with 2 more in production. I think 2 that were supposed to be 1, and then there are a dozen more of them planned, all of them in New York City. And he says, like most of our publishers, it's been rewarding in ways that go beyond the daily cha-ching of that notification you get when you sell a tour. So, Tom, over to you. What can you tell us about telling a story and producing a VoiceMap tour?
Thank you, Ian. And thank you for illustrating one of my points about telling a story that has visuals and sound effects. A smashing bottle of wine is exactly the way to open a story. Thank you, everyone. I feel a little bit like I'm preaching to the choir here because I see some very accomplished publishers on this, tours that I have taken and enjoyed very much. So I'm happy to share. I'm going to dive right in with a salute to Helene, who built the presentation deck. She's going to be driving so that I can just talk. The tour creation process, as most of you already know, has 4 basic steps. There's research, route planning, the script, and the production. And today I'm going to focus just on the script, because if your script is dull, your tour is going to be dull. I'm going to share 15 tips that work for me, but I'm not suggesting everyone's tour should sound like mine. In fact, my first tip is, number 1, make it personal. Or as Ian would say, make it weirdly human. Some VoiceMap publishers are quite funny or lively or quirky or passionate or enthusiastic, and many of you have personal experiences from growing up in or living in a particular neighborhood. So tell your story. Here's a really charming example from Shireen Habib in South Africa.
Look over at the hillside on your left, right up to the top. You should be able to see eucalyptus trees and a long aerial tower. My mom's house is the last house before that tower. I was born up there. When we were teenagers, we always told my grandfather that we want to live in District 6 where the action was. And we wanted to move because we feel like fools on the hill. And then he'd say, one day you'll see, you ungrateful little girls. The whole city will come up to you.
That makes me smile every time I listen to it. Of course, many of us are creating tours about historical events from decades before we were even born in places we didn't grow up. But that doesn't mean you can't still tell stories your way, your unique voice, your personality. That's one thing that AI can't do. With that in mind, let's move on to some tips that anyone can use. Script tip number 2, talk about the people, not the place. You can take your listeners on a walk through a city filled with amazing art and architecture and history and still bore them to death. What makes a tour dull? Too many names, dates, facts. And what makes a tour interesting? Personalities, relationships, emotions, and drama. We humans are just wired to care about humans, and we care more about individual people than about groups. There's a saying, a single death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic, and statistics are boring. Fundraising experts know that you touch more hearts and raise more money with the story of a single starving child than with a statistic about a million starving children. They call this the identifiable victim effect. So when creating a tour, instead of talking about the thousands who fought in a battle or died in a plague or were sold into slavery or suffered in a prison or immigrated to America, tell the story of just one. Ask yourself, who is my main character? Is it the victor or the villain, or maybe it's the victim, as in this graphic example from Annie Sargent in Paris, for which Helene suggests I give a trigger warning as it is quite violent.
Ravaillac was put through terrible torture before he died.
I just lost the audio on that.
The executioners started with burning his right hand and forearm with molten lead and sulfur. They didn't stop until the bones were exposed. Why the right hand? Because that's the hand he used to stab the king. Then they ripped his nipples off with metal pincers. Then they attached his forelimbs to ropes, which were tied to horses that were made to pull his limbs off. When they had him quartered at long last, they let the people take away some parts of his body and burned the rest in place. And all of this was to the delight of the people who loved to see a prisoner get his dues.
So I see Annie is on the call. Thank you, Annie, for that. I just took that tour a week before last in your lovely city. So you could imagine telling that same story from the point of view of the executioner, or from someone in the crowd who watched it with glee or with horror. The point is, choosing a single person to focus on makes the story human and helps us feel something. Gives us a character to root for, to love, or to loathe. And Annie does another smart thing here. She mentions one name, that of the main character. This keeps it simple for the listener. If you listen to the track that we sent in advance about the 6 firemen who survived the 9/11 collapse of the World Trade Center, you'll hear that I did the same thing there, giving only the name of Joe Jonas, the unit leader, not of all 5 firemen. Then you can describe everyone else in your story by their relationship to the named character, his teammates, his executioner, his boss, his daughter. An exception would be a story that says it's about a relationship, a love story, a struggle for power, a tale of revenge. There you may need 2 names. In my story about the firemen, I did eventually introduce a second named character, Josephine, the woman that they saved, and with whom they formed a relationship. But even there, try to keep it to no more than 2 named characters, though the exception might be a love triangle. Still, requiring your listener to keep 3 names or more in their head at once is really asking a lot. Now, any story of the executioner and of the fireman are both pretty good examples of script tip number 3. Write screenplays, not encyclopedia entries. I bet you had a high school writing teacher who told you, show, don't tell. Good storytelling activates something called theater of the mind. If I tell you a story about an elephant wearing a pink tutu while riding a blue bicycle across a high wire, you cannot help but create that mental image in your mind's eye. Every one of you is doing it right now. So whenever possible, think about how to tell a human story in a way that creates a little movie for the mind. Let's try an example. This is the Wikipedia entry for the Metropolitan Club, where I start my Gilded Age tour. You don't need to read all this, but at a glance, you can see it's just a lot of facts and names and dates, nothing that creates a mental image in your mind's eye. But the last line does hint at a human drama. Now, I'm a huge fan of Wikipedia, especially the footnotes, which led me to a source with an actual description of how J.P. Morgan's friend was denied membership, which helped me turn this dry encyclopedia entry into a story with a bit of human drama. One by one, the men of the Union Club dropped marbles into a polished wooden box. J.P. Morgan had sponsored a wealthy friend for membership. You know the board game Monopoly, with the character rich Uncle Pennybags? The guy with the top hat, monocle, walrus mustache, and bag of cash? Well, that's based on J.P. Morgan, a man who actually created monopolies. So rich that he once bailed out the U.S. government with gold from his own vaults. And when the Union Club opened the box, all the marbles were white. Except one. Morgan's friend had been blackballed because of his table manners.
He ate with his knife.
Which leads us to another thing your high school teacher probably told you. Tip number 4, actively avoid passive voice. Passive verbs describe a state of being. Is, was, am, are, be, being, been, become, has, have, had. If I say, John is upset, we are simply describing his inner state of being. We create no mental picture. But if we use active verbs, John rampaged down the street, kicking trash cans and smashing windows, well, now you start to see things with your mind's eye and even hear things. So let's look again at the Wikipedia entry for the Metropolitan Club and highlight all the passive verbs. When we talk about buildings and squares and statues, it's hard not to use passive verbs because buildings are not alive. Buildings don't fall in love or start wars. People do. So make the story about the people. Now, does this mean you should never use passive voice? No. Here's a gripping example of an exception from Thailand by Christopher Burslam.
By that evening, 4,000 angry paramilitaries had massed at the gates of Thammasat. Inside, about 2,000 students were still holding their sit-in. Dozens of students were shot. Some tried to flee by jumping into the river, where they were fired on by Navy boats. The remaining students were rounded up, stripped, and forced to lie down on this field. Many were savagely beaten. The bodies of some of the dead were piled up, covered in gasoline, and set ablaze.
Now, technically, this is passive voice. The students are not acting, they're being acted upon, but there's definitely action, and our minds are forming vivid mental images. What the passive voice does here is it focuses our attention on the students instead of on the military, and that makes the emotional impact greater. Script tip number 5, start with action. In the story of the Metropolitan Club, I opened with an action, a small one, dropping marbles into a box. One by one, the men of the Union Club dropped marbles into a polished wooden box. That's an action. You can see a mental image in your mind, and it puts you in the room where and when it happened. Here's another example. When in the dark of night, a young man in a hoodie pulls cans of spray paint from his backpack and starts tagging a wall, is it a criminal act of vandalism or an important work of self-expression? It was in this building in the 1980s that a gallery called 51X first rebranded graffiti as
urban contemporary art,
showcasing the works of Jean-Michel Basquiat, Keith Haring, and even Johnny Rotten of the Sex Pistols. So if you think about it, an art gallery is just a silent room where stuff hangs motionlessly on walls. But the sound of spray cans painting graffiti puts you there at the moment of creation, makes for a much more energizing track. Often starting with the action means starting at the beginning. The story of the Metropolitan Club starts when J.P. Morgan's friend gets blackballed from another club. Screenwriters will refer to this as the inciting event. But the best action to start with isn't always the first action. Murder mysteries start with the murder and then spend the whole movie investigating the events that led up to it. People love a mystery. So the question is finding the action that is most engaging and letting that be how you build your story. One surefire way to find or start with action is what I call make an entrance or an exit. Quite often, we're just standing on the street in front of a closed building. You can add a bit of action by asking your listeners to imagine the story's characters arriving or departing through the door or up the steps that you can see in front of you. The track that we sent in advance about the firefighters opens with these words. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, this red door rolled up and a red engine rolled out. The rest of the story actually happens a mile away, but now we've visually connected that story to this spot with a little bit of opening action. Here's another example.
On a January night in 1897, the carriages began arriving.
Mrs. Astor, accompanied by John Jacob Astor IV.
A lavish housewarming party
Mamie Fish, escorted by Stuyvesant.
to celebrate the completion of this fabulous Beaux-Arts design by Carrere and Hastings.
The Stanford Whites.
So instead of just standing across the street from a mansion, we're now imagining the street filled with carriages as the famous Gilded Age personalities arrive and climb the steps. Now, some of you out there may be thinking, wait, you just told us to only use 1 or 2 names at a time, and you just reeled off 7. Well, thank you for listening so carefully. This is an example of what I would call name dropping. I don't expect you to remember these names. The story is not about them, but they serve to illustrate how fabulous the event was. It's like rattling off all the famous people who attended a certain school or belonged to a posh club. Script tip number 7, give them something to get. Think about how a good joke works. You set up a situation, you build the drama, then you provide a surprising twist. And the listener has this moment where their brain says, oh, I get it. I see what you did there. And that makes them laugh. I learned this in advertising. Research shows that when you involve the listener, ask their brains to do just a little bit of work in a way that rewards or entertains them, a switch flips in their brain and a memory gets created. They remember your message and they feel positively about your brand, or in this case, your tour. You can also engage brains in other way, with humor, for instance. For a cafe in Brooklyn, where people pay money to hang out with cats, I filled the script with playful cat puns.
Stop here for a meow-ment.
The Cat Cafe is a woman-run, volunteer-driven nonprofit helping stray cats find forever homes. For a $12 donation, you can spend a half hour in paradise. Don't miss the second floor catio. They do sell some snacks and coffee, but don't expect the barista to whip you up a cappuccino. Though it sounds implausible, they actually use tame rats to nurture homeless kittens, who must be kept separate from other cats until they've had all their shots.
The rats take great care of the cats.
I am not kidding you.
You can also, thank you for that. You can also engage someone's brains with a bit of cleverness in your writing. This is the townhouse where Edgar Allan Poe lived when he wrote his famous poem, The Raven. The poem has a very distinctive cadence. While I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. So I gave myself the challenge to actually use that cadence to write a script.
Edgar Allan Poe lived in New York when he wrote many of his most famous works, including The Raven. At one point, he lived here at number 137. So it's quite possible that this was the place where he was nearly napping when suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at his chamber door. And perhaps one of those windows is the one upon which he heard a tapping louder than before, and in through which there stepped a stately raven to perch above his chamber door. And is this where he asked the raven if he'd ever be reunited with his lost love named Lenore? Quoth the raven, nevermore.
Another useful tip is to put your listener in the moment. Sometimes you may want to shift into the present tense and tell the story as though we are actually there as it happens, seeing it unfold before us, like this track from Dan Weiser in Baltimore.
Imagine it's the 1930s, during Prohibition. It's 3 a.m. on a late August morning. 10-year-old Andrew Loy is awakened by his father. One goes outside and the other to the basement. Under the cover of darkness, wine grapes are delivered and carefully dropped through a coal chute to the basement. The family was secretly making wine to raise money to buy the building they lived in.
So, story told in the present tense. A way to take that even further is to consider making your listener the actual principal character in the story. Sometimes I not only do that, and not only shift in the present tense, but ask them to imagine that they are the person doing the action.
Imagine it's a warm summer night in, 1960. You're a guy in a bar. An attractive woman starts flirting with you, invites you back to her place in this apartment building. While she makes you a drink, you look around. There's some pretty kinky art on the walls and an unusually large mirror. You take a sip and you think, man, is this for real? And then suddenly, you're not sure what's real anymore. You've just been given LSD by the CIA. On the other side of that big mirror is a CIA operative named George White, running a program called MK Ultra, codename Midnight Climax. For a decade, he employed hookers to lure unwitting test subjects to this apartment building, where they were secretly given all manner of hallucinogenic drugs, then observed, often while having sex.
I tend to not use that first-person trick more than once in a tour, but it can be a lot of fun. Script tip number 10, tell me a secret. I think all of you know this already, and many of you do it quite well. Point out the detail that everyone misses. That image on the left is called the Hidden Witch of Central Park, and it's on the backside of a pilaster obscured by shrubbery. There are several wild theories about why it's there, but people love it when you let them in on a secret. So take me down the hidden alley or into the speakeasy, make me feel superior to all the other tourists who just walked right by it. Tip number 11, consider breaking stories into chapters. If you read books on screenwriting, they often talk about the stages of classic storytelling. I called them the setup, the build-up, the blow-up, and the upshot. Another version of that is the screenwriting formula: chase your characters up a tree, throw rocks at them, and get them down, either safely or with a tragic fall. The firefighter story you listened to in advance is a good example. We literally chased firemen up a building, and then we got them down safely. You may have noticed that I use different music to cue the different chapters in the story, changing the mood as we go along. Or let's say you have a single building that has had many lives, home to a founding father, and then to a famous author, and then to a communist spy, and then to an avant-garde theater. Each of those might be told as its own little short story with its own little personality. Script tip number 12, talk while you walk. The best tours on VoiceMap feel like a continuous entertainment experience. 2 minutes of dead silence while I'm walking from one location to another is just a lost opportunity. Tell me a story. Use the walking time between the stops to set the scene for what we're about to see, or to add a follow-up to the stop we just left. I did that with the fireman story, telling how they later served as pallbearers for the woman they saved as we walked to the next location. Or you can use the walking time to weave a tale that runs throughout the entire tour. In my tour of Washington Square, I weave the story of a famous murder and trial throughout the entire tour, building the story as segments in between stops. My tour of Brooklyn Heights tells a scandalous story of a famous abolitionist preacher, starting at one statue of him, continuing the story throughout, and then ending at another statue of him. Doing this, of course, is hard. It requires careful word counts, repeated tests, lots of adjustments, but your VoiceMap editors are here to keep you honest. Script tip number 13, write tight. Are you familiar with 6-word stories? It's a writing exercise. Here's a famous one attributed to Ernest Hemingway. For sale, baby shoes, never worn. An entire tale of heartbreak in just 6 words. Or this one, hello, crying, hello, screaming, hello, silence. And if the words in parentheses were replaced with sound effects, that's a horror story in just 3 words. So once I complete a first draft, which I do in a Google Doc, not in MapMaker, partly because I like to be able to color code it and know what's a quote and what's a direction and so forth. I run a word count on the whole script and I compare it to my other tours for general length. And then no matter what, I give myself a goal to cut the script by 20%. I go through it over and over and over. It's like distilling the stories to only what's necessary to tell them best. I write, I rewrite, I trim, and I trim again. For instance, if they can see it, cut it. Don't tell them that this is a statue of a man on a horse cast in bronze. They can see that. Instead, tell them about the thing that they can't see that's hidden in the statue or represented by it. I also try to save longer stories for locations where there's a place to sit. If you're going to make someone stand for a long time in one place, it better be a darn good story. Tip number 14, consider using multiple voices. There are many great tours on VoiceMap with nothing more than a single engaging voice. But I would bet that many of your favorite podcasts use at least 2 voices to break up the information and keep things snappy. On my tours, I do all the basic narration myself, and I use a separate voice for the directions. I think that it helps the listener focus on directions. I also use separate voices for actual quotes from historical characters in the story. Sometimes I use a filter to make the recording sound archival and distinguish them from the narration. Sometimes I find actual archival recordings. Of course, you have to do your research about your legal rights on using those. You can also do interviews. There's a charming VoiceMap tour in Baltimore's Little Italy where Dan Weiser, the publisher, interviewed characters in the neighborhood and then included them in the tour. And sometimes I use multiple voices for lists. Like if I was going to reel off all the famous movies shot in Central Park, I can then overlap the titles to create a montage, which I think adds some energy and moves along a little faster. In my first tours, I used to invite my friends and neighbor over and record them performing the lines that I needed. I set up a table with bottles of wine, and they could pick one up on the way out, and it was fun. Helene says that you can put out a call to other publishers and ask them to record voices for you. That's cool. I personally now am using some AI voices from 11 Labs. It gives me tremendous flexibility to keep revising and changing a story even as I'm editing. If you try this, you need to be careful because you don't want to end up with voices that sound like AI voices. One of the things to try is don't default automatically to the text-to-speech tool where you paste copy in for an AI voice to read. Instead, try the voice changer tool. This lets you read the line yourself to get the delivery the way you want it, and then it changes you into the character that you want. The results are often much more natural. My last script tip is use the power of sound. Don't take my word for it. Here are some quotes from famous film directors. Every time I hear sounds, I see pictures, says David Lynch. Sound is 50% of the movie-going experience, says George Lucas, the man we associate more than anything else with visual special effects. Sound is more important than pictures, says Michael Moore. With the power of sound, you're no longer just a tour guide. You're a tour guide who has brought along a troupe of actors, a symphony orchestra, and an entire special effects team. Sound effects, even simple ones, can be like a little time machine, transporting listeners to the moment when your story took place. Music not only locates the listener in time, it can cue them what to feel, suspense or longing or triumph or despair. Of course, finding the right music, really hard, can take you a lot of time. But this is not just something that happens in production. It starts in the writing. Just as we want to write in a way that creates mental images, we need to write in a way that calls out for the proper sonic enhancement. I should probably mention here that I do all of my own audio production, recording, sound effects, music, mixing, mastering. This gives me a level of control and the ability to experiment to my heart's content I can spend all day just looking for the right splat sound effect if it amuses me. But with all of that said, that's 15 tips. And to be clear, they are only tips, not rules. So in closing, I'd like to pose 2 questions. Number 1 is, how do you measure success? I got to say, the daily cha-ching sound coming from my phone is pretty nice. But here's what matters more to me. We've talked about how a key to effective storytelling is to describe physical actions that create mental images in the theater of the mind. And when we do this successfully, I believe we evoke physical reactions in the listener. They smile, they laugh, they get a lump in their throat or a tear in their eye, their hearts race, their pulses pound, they get goosebumps. So for me, nothing is more encouraging than when I get comments on my tours like these. Brilliant, funny. My teenage son and I laughed a lot. Our jaws dropped at some of the anecdotes. By the end, I had a tear in my eye. It felt like it was in a walking movie. They didn't just learn something, they felt something. So my final question is this: can audio tours be art? Now, even with your Zoom screens turned off, I can see some of you rolling your eyes. But did you watch the Oscars? They gave awards for great scripts. They gave awards for sound design and editing and narration and music. They gave awards for documentaries. Well, a great audio tour is a documentary created from a script with narration and editing, plus sound design and music. The Grammy Awards now have a category for podcasts, but making an audio tour is actually harder with GPS and directions and word counts to get right. Now, maybe you're just trying to make some extra income with minimal effort, but I would challenge you to make something so entertaining and fun and moving that people will take another of your tours and another one and drag their friends out to try it too. Make something so artful that one day someone invites you to fly to LA and put on designer clothes and go up on stage and accept a little statue and take a deep breath and thank the Academy and your mother and your VoiceMap editor for believing in you when no one else did, as the music swells and your audience stands and cheers. And that's how you tell the story. Thank you.
That was fantastic, Tom. Thank you.
My pleasure.
I think we'd like to open it up to questions. I've got some of my own, but I think we've spent plenty of time talking about audio tours, the two of us together. So already. So does anybody have questions for Tom? If you drop them in the chat, we can ask for you, but you're welcome to just unmute yourself, I think, Helene, and just tell us what you're thinking. Dan? You'll need to unmute yourself. I can try and find you.
There we go. Hey, Tom. So good.
Hey, Dan.
And nice to see you. Thanks for the kind words.
Sure.
2 things. When I used to work in TV news, we used to talk about a listener losing focus after 45 seconds of a single voice and always trying to get a sound or another voice into there. And obviously that's something you're able to do really well. And now a question would be, is sometimes I have long passages and a person's walking and now a street comes up and they have to cross the street and I hate breaking up that passage. And yet it's not necessarily a place where somebody can stop. Any suggestions on something like that? I know it's a particular problem.
Yeah, I have tried every solution for that. Some work better than others. I totally feel your pain on it. You get a good roll going, and suddenly you got to interject a thing. For me, having the second voice that does the directions, I generally try to leave that voice in the clear, which I think is a cue to the listener that, okay, I got to pay attention to, I got to use my direction brain for the moment. But there are times, particularly just as you described, where I can sort of let the story continue and have the direction voice just sort of float in and say, don't forget to continue straight across the street. And then you just continue with your story so that you make sure you hit it at the right time. But it comes in as a direction, not as you having to, jerk yourself out of your storytelling mode. And then sometimes I totally agree with the 45-second limit. I'm finding for myself, I tend, even if I'm telling a longer story, I will use pieces of music to cue the little chapters, and I try to write it as little chapters and have these transitions in between, which I think helps break up longer stories. And sometimes you will have to do that with your, I get 40 seconds to the end of the block, so I have to finish that little story up in a certain way, let my directions happen, meet them on the other side of the street with another direction, and then, pick up the next chapter of the story. So you're writing in chapters at that point.
Thank you. And in the current one that I'm writing now, I have added a female voice, a friend of mine, to do directions because I just think it would help break it up. So I was really happy to hear you talk about that too and incorporating that.
Yeah, just make sure you never piss that friend off, because if your directions change, you're going to have to go back and revise it.
I think silence is also really useful for directions, because it's basically when things go silent that people realize they need to know what to do next. And so if you leave that there and they've drifted off, they're going to start paying attention.
Yeah, that is my preference, and it also makes it easier when directions do change, because they will. You'll have construction barriers and things that pop up. So by leaving the voice in the clear for the directions, it's much easier to change them later.
There are some questions coming up in the chat. Annie says writing short is always difficult, which I guess, trying to keep it brief when there's a lot to say.
I was lucky in a sense to have a career where I had no choice. I had a 30-second TV spot or radio spot, and they were not going to give me an extra second. So I was forced, and then you think you've write a 30-second spot, you go into a recording studio that's billing you $1,000 an hour with a celebrity talent who you've got 15 minutes of their time, and suddenly your script doesn't fit, and you are on the hook to rewrite that script and take 3 seconds out of it on the spot. That's good practice. But for me now, because I have the time, I write a script that pleases me the first draft, and then I go back and I trim and cut and trim and cut. So I don't always hold myself to the time up front, but then I do try to go back and see, can I tell the same story more effectively and just in less time? And I'll have to say, I probably have some of the longest tracks of anybody on VoiceMap. I've got one for Stonewall Inn, which is one of my proudest creations. It's probably close to 7 minutes long. But there is a bench where you can sit. And I do think the story the tale is worth the telling. And I've gotten some very good feedback on it. There may be also people who that's as far as they get on the tour and they go home. I have no idea.
Yeah, I do think that there's this feeling that you have to, especially when people do their first tour, that you have to deliver a lot of value, and that part of the value is just the breadth and depth of the narrative. How much information am I communicating here, and are people going to feel like it was worth the money, just in terms of informational load? But I think actually people feel much more satisfaction having been able to have their attention fully there for the whole tour, and having got to the end of the tour, they feel a much greater sense of satisfaction if they weren't kind of just dragging their feet at the end of it just to finish the thing.
And I think that thinking like a screenwriter instead of an encyclopedia writer helps you in that, because it allows you to start saying, okay, I know these facts. These facts are all in the Wikipedia entry, but do they help the story? And if they don't help the story, you can start taking them out, because people care about the story. They probably are not going to remember all the facts that you gave them.
So are you using the paid or free version of 11 Labs?
I'm using, I think I pay $5 a month, but it feels like an incredible deal. I saw a question about sound effects as well. I use And these are things, it's funny, when I first started this, partly because I started on my own platform before I moved over to VoiceMap, I felt sort of competitive, like I've got all these secrets now, I'm not going to tell people. But then I've also realized that I am so slow at making my tours that I'm never going to go conquer the world and compete with anybody in Italy or England or anywhere else. So I'm happy to share. I use Envato, E-N-V-A-T-O. I pay a yearly subscription to that. It makes sense for me because I'm doing enough tours and this is sort of my full-time hobby. They have fantastic sound effects library. I think they were recently bought by Shutterstock. They were independent. And they have a really good music library. I started to get a little tired because I found myself going back to the same tracks and I felt bad about reusing them in tour after tour. So I have now added Epidemic Sound as well. I pay a yearly subscription. They do offer some sound effects libraries, and they even offer an AI. You can tell them a sound effect and they'll create it for you. I haven't had a lot of luck with that. But I use those two sources, Envato and Epidemic Sound for my music, and Envato in particular for sound effects. There's almost nothing you can't find on there.
I think Epidemic Sound is a company that could only be named by a tech bro.
Yeah, they have the best platform.
Okay,
it's also really easy to
an increasing number of sort of AI you can generate.
Yeah,
you know,
and Epidemic is
yeah,
Epidemic is now offering that. They even have a new tool that just came out a week or two ago where you can take a track and tell them the length you want it cut to, and they'll cut it for you. Or you can call up the stems of a piece of music, which means the vocal line, the instrument line, the bass line. Previously, they would let you download all the stems and mix them yourself, which is really a lot of work. And now they've got a tool that lets you basically turn them on and off as you want before you download it. So you can just basically say, strip the vocal out of that, and boom, you get a copy that has no vocal.
So, Kay, I think if you use these platforms that Tom is talking about, they're intended to be royalty free.
Yes.
Right? So
yeah, you pay one subscription and you download it, and it automatically generates a license that goes in some folder somewhere. I have no idea, but you can use them at will on everything, except that they may have some restrictions for, like, if you're putting them on broadcast TV or, you know, big stuff. But for what we're doing, you just download to it's an all-you-can-eat buffet.
And we have within the team our own library of this music and these sound effects, and so we use them across tours. But if there's something specific that you feel your tour needs, then you'll have to go beyond kind of what we're able to offer to publishers as a whole. Anybody else got questions? Kay, yes, although yeah, I mean, if a tour is due for an update, it can be mixed to add music and effects. It would sort of need to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. Obviously, we can't go back and update this across the board because we would be doing nothing else. But yes, depends.
Yeah, and I will say, I should say up front that the way I work makes it pretty much impossible to translate my tours into other languages. Where some of you, if you did a single voice tour, you've got a lot of options for having it reread in a different language. And I know VoiceMap's been making great strides on that, because I may have 10 voices in a particular 45, 50 second bit. And because they're woven tightly into music and sound effects, translating them into languages that are longer or shorter would just be a nightmare.
I have a question, if I may.
Sure.
Please.
Yeah, basically, you've obviously got a good studio, because to do all these things.
I am sitting in my studio right now. I have this microphone, which cost, I don't know, $150. I have 2 towels hanging on the wall, and I have a second monitor. I have a window right next to me. So I have to plan around the fact that I live in suburbia where there are guys with leaf blowers and lawnmowers all day long on in the fall and spring and summer. and I'm near a jetway, so I have to time in between the jets, and I have a train two blocks away. And I have a sort of an old Mac that fan tends to run a lot when it's charging itself. I need to upgrade. I should come up with something better, but no, I don't have a professional studio booth or box.
But you've got special software for mixing.
Yeah, I use Logic Pro. I use Logic Pro, which is it's the professional version of GarageBand. For most of what I do, I could easily just use GarageBand, which is the free Macintosh program. But Logic Pro gives me a few more things that just make my life easier, and I'm spending all my time doing this, so I thought it was worth the investment.
Yeah, thank you.
But you only pay one fee, and then you're done.
Thank you.
There's a question from Deborah in the Q&A section. She's just asking, I'm trying to rewrite a tour. My problem is that the locations are interesting, but not necessarily connected to each other time-wise. Is there any advice you can give to make the tour gel?
That's a really good question. I have tours that are at the opposite extremes. I have my Gilded Age tour focuses on stories from the Gilded Age, though I did find that I could weave in, here's who built this mansion, and here's the Gilded Age person of today that lives in it, like Jeffrey Epstein lived in one of these mansions. So that made an interesting way to put past and present together, but it kept it within this theme of people living in these gilded cages. I have other stories that are just a total potpourri. Stories from the 1800s, from the Dutch era, from the British era, from the early American era, from the 60s, from the 70s. I have a style that's very distinctive, a voice that carries the whole thing through. And my wife's favorite tours are the ones that feel like a grab bag and every stop is a total surprise because it's just a really good story, but a really different story. I'm working on the East Village right now, which has all those elements of New York. It has the old Dutch, it has the British, it has it has the hippies, it has the punks, it has, and I find it's great fun to jump around, and I don't think it necessarily has to have a theme. I do have other ones where, like my Brooklyn Heights tour, weaves a single story of a single character through the whole tour. A lot more work. But yeah, I think anything can work as long as your storytelling is engaging and people are having a good time.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Sure.
I think it's fun to take a few, you can be silly sometimes and take a few creative risks. I don't, ultimately, I feel people create boundaries around this because it's an audio tour and they think that it needs to have a certain feeling to it that is generally a fairly stiff and formal. But we were given, when I was still working on scripts, the challenge of a tour around the vineyards at Groot Constantia, where the bottle of wine I got for you, Tom, was from Groot Constantia. And
still going to rub that in. Thank you.
Yeah, actually, I'm not done. And we gave voices to the vines, right? And then they spoke with the personality of the wine that those grapes are used to make. They were all, and this is just to say that sometimes it's a little silly, but it works well, and it's supposed to be a fun kind of walk around a vineyard. So nobody's, looking for you to. Nobody wants to be a sommelier by the end of the tour, and they just want to have a bit of fun. And so I think that taking a few creative risks and having a bit of fun with it. It sounds like you have a lot of fun with the process. Do you think that is that fair, and does that kind of help?
You're talking to me with that question?
Yeah,
absolutely. And I think you could identify what you're talking about as finding a concept. Taking Edgar Allan Poe's poem and using it to structure the stop was a concept, a creative concept. Taking cat puns and using them at the silliest place you've ever seen, a cat cafe, was a concept. I came up with an idea for that stop, but the idea was integral to the nature of the stop and the story that I wanted to tell. And that's what I did in advertising. I got to talk about this toothpaste today. I need a concept. I need an idea, because nobody just wants to hear me talk about, flavor and cavity protection. So that's the way you go. Coming up with concepts doesn't mean that your first idea is going to be your best idea. Sometimes you write it and you think, that's not going to work, or I can do better. Or sometimes you need to write it. Don't be afraid to abandon a bad idea rather than continuing to try to make it work. And do things that are right for you. There's a quote from Mark Twain, I think, that says, humor is like a loaded gun. In the wrong hands, it's a truly dangerous thing. Not everybody's funny. I took a tour, which will remain unnamed, a couple of weeks ago, with someone who thought that they were very funny. And to me, they really were not. And I would rather them have just given me the information straight. So, find what makes you, you, and what do your friends like about you. Be that.
Arikal, are you still there? There's a question from Arikal, but I'm not sure I quite understand it. It's how has the art of audio tour storytelling informed the way you tell personal stories to a crowd? I guess the question is maybe that has telling these types of stories, but this is, again, something you've been doing for a long, long time, made you better at sort of telling stories in person.
Well, the art of storytelling, I think, is somewhat universal, whether you're doing it on the page or in audio or, to a crowd. Today's presentation was completely scripted. Every word you heard me say, with some editorializing along the way, is on a page right in front of me on another screen. I didn't leave this to chance. I didn't say, I'm just going to vamp this thing. That's just not my way. I've learned over the years that nothing beats hard work to get a good result. I also didn't want to do a talk that was a lot of just exhortations to be more interesting. I wanted to try to say, here's an actual tangible thing you can see and you can do yourself. That seemed important to me to if I could be of any help, would be particularly for the person who's attempting this for the first time, to have some tangible tips to be able to say, oh, I get it. I see that I can talk about people coming in and out that door as a way to connect the story to the place.
Well, we're nearly at the hour. I guess I have one more question, unless somebody else has a last question.
There's a question from Annette in the chat. Annette's question, do you identify a specific target audience when you are developing your tour content?
Yes, me. One of the great things about being retired is I no longer have clients, and I no longer have bosses, and I no longer have focus groups. So I try to make the tour that I would want to take. And I keep going until I feel like, wow, now I'm proud of this. I've gotten to a point where I think this is really cool and I can't wait to put it out in the world. I also have a wife who is a very tough critic. And she's also my test subject. So once I've got a tour and we go out on the street, I give her own copy of it on the phone, her own earbuds, and I make sure to stay behind her so that I'm never leading her in the directions. And she is excellent at taking my directions wrong and heading off somewhere else, which is a great way to idiot-proof. Not that my wife's an idiot, she's actually really smart, but it's a way to make sure that no one is going to mistake the directions. So it's good to have somebody to test it for you. And there have been times where I thought I was done with a tour, and she took my tour of the Brooklyn Bridge, and she said, wow, I just really wanted to know more about this and you left these characters and you didn't finish the story, and you need to go fix that. And so I went back and rewrote about a third of the tour and had to change where things happened and all the timings. It was a lot of work, but she was right. She was absolutely right. So it's good to have a sounding board you trust.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like you're only writing for you.
Yeah, though in terms of being my own creative director, I feel like after all these years, I've earned the right to do that.
For sure. It sounds like there's a little bit of kind of recovering from corporate copywriting.
There's definitely some PTSD there. In fact, that's the funny thing is that I should be doing more to market my own tours here in New York. And I know a lot about marketing, and all of those things that require marketing is the last thing I want to do. I want to sit here and make tours. I want to tell stories. I don't want to go out and have to harangue concierges and do social posts and all this stuff. That feels like work. So I'm going to trust you guys to do that.
Good. Well, if there are no more questions, if anybody does have a question, we can run a little long. But if there aren't, thank you so much, Tom.
Thank you everyone who took the time out of your busy day to tune in. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it was so comprehensive and so well thought through, and certainly something we will come back to and make available in a number of formats, because I think it's difficult to internalize even a small part of it in just one sitting, and you need to think about it while working on a tour over and over again. And so we'll see how we can make it available easily while people are actually working on tours. So yeah, thank you so much, and thank you to everybody for joining us.